The letter hit the kitchen table like a death sentence. Pauline Turner's hands were shaking so badly that the paper rattled against the worn wood, and she pressed both palms flat against the surface to stop herself from crumbling entirely. The numbers on the page did not change no matter how many times she blinked. $340. That was what the First National Bank of Hays City, Kansas, said she owed them. $340 by the first day of October, or the Turner farm, every acre of prairie grass, every fence post her father had driven into the earth with his own 2 hands, every single furrow of soil he had turned for 22 years, would be seized and sold at public auction. It was the 14th of April, 1878. She had 1 season. Pauline was 26 years old, recently orphaned and completely alone, standing in a kitchen that still smelled faintly of her father's pipe tobacco, even though Elias Turner had been cold in the ground for 3 weeks. The crops were not yet planted. The seed money was gone because her father had borrowed against it in the months before the fever took him, and the only thing standing between Pauline and absolute destitution was a stubborn refusal to accept that this was the end. She heard boots on the porch before the knock came. Heavy, unhurried, the kind of boots that belonged to a man who had nowhere to rush to because he made every moment count on its own terms. Clark Sutton did not wait long after knocking. He never did, not because he was rude, but because they had known each other long enough that waiting felt performative. When she opened the door, his face read her instantly. He was 30 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples when the spring humidity got into it. His eyes were a steady, deep brown that always reminded Pauline of the Kansas earth after rain, dark and honest, and capable of holding more than it showed on the surface. He had a coffee tin in one hand and his hat in the other, and something about that image, this big, careful man standing on her porch holding coffee and his hat like an offering, nearly destroyed her composure entirely. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Bad," she said, and her voice only broke on the one syllable. He came inside without being invited, which was also something he had always done, set the coffee tin on the counter and picked up the letter from the table. He read it twice. She watched his jaw tighten, watched the muscle there work silently, watched the calculation move behind his eyes. "340, he said, "by October 1st. He set the letter down very carefully, as though it were a thing that could detonate if handled wrong. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, not pity, nothing as insulting as that, but something rower, something that looked like a man deciding something important before he had fully let himself understand what he was deciding. "Then we get it planted," he said, "starting Monday." Pauline had known Clark Sutton her entire adult life. He had moved onto the neighboring quarter section 8 years ago, a young man of 22 with a string of mules, a reputation for stubbornness, and a dark past he never volunteered and she had never pushed for. They had traded labor during harvest seasons, shared fencing costs along the boundary line between their properties, argued about water rights for the creek that split the difference between them. They had never been exactly friends in the soft, social sense of the word, but they had been something more solid than that, something forged in the shared understanding of what it meant to work land that did not love you back, not until you loved it first. But she had never once, in all those years, seen him look at her the way he looked at her that April morning over her father's death notice and her bank's ultimatum. She had not expected to feel what she felt in response to it. She turned toward the counter and began measuring out the coffee because she needed something to do with her hands. "I can't ask you to do that, Clark. Your own fields need planting." "I didn't say I was waiting to be asked," he replied, pulling out a chair and sitting down like a man settling in for a long conversation, not a short one. That was how it began. Pauline Turner had grown up on this land. Her father, Elias Turner, had come out to western Kansas in 1856 when the soil was still contested, and the question of what Kansas would become, free state or slave state, was being answered in fire and blood. He had staked his claim, married her mother Ruth the following spring, and spent the next 2 decades turning raw prairie into something that produced corn and winter wheat, and a modest income that kept them in boots and flour, and the occasional small luxury. Ruth Turner had died of cholera when Pauline was 11. After that, it had been just the two of them. Elias and Pauline working the farm through drought years and good years and in-between years, through the grasshopper plague of 1874 that stripped every crop in the county to bare stalks, through the hard winter of 1876 that froze the winter wheat in the ground. Pauline had never married, partly because there had never been much time for courting, and partly because the men who had come around had always felt like they wanted the land more than they wanted her, and she had inherited too much of her father's stubbornness to settle for that bargain. Then Elias had gotten sick in January. By February it was clear the fever was going to win. By March he was gone. He had left her the farm, which should have been everything, except that in his last year he had borrowed heavily. The seed money, a new plow, doctors' fees that mounted up faster than grain prices, and now the bank wanted its money. What Pauline knew about farming she knew in her bones. What she did not know was how she was going to do it alone. Clark Sutton's own story was not one he told readily, but Pauline had gathered pieces of it over 8 years the way you gather kindling slowly, without pressing, picking up what fell naturally in your path. He had come from Missouri. There had been a family there, older parents and a younger brother. Something had happened during the war years that he never named directly, only referred to occasionally with a particular careful blankness that told her the wound was still live. He had drifted west afterward, worked cattle drives for a few years out of Abilene, saved his money with the kind of grim discipline that people who have had everything stripped from them tend to develop, and then bought his quarter section at 22 and never looked back. He had no wife, had never seemed to want one, or at least had never let anyone see that he did. The women in Hays City tended to find him attractive, which he appeared not to notice, and occasionally intimidating, which he appeared to notice and not particularly mind. What Pauline had noticed over 8 years of proximity was that Clark Sutton was the kind of man who showed up. Not with speeches or grand gestures, but with presence. When the fence between their properties went down in the big storm of 1875, he was at her door at first light with posts and wire. When she had been down with a lung inflammation the following winter, she had found firewood on her porch every morning for 3 weeks without ever seeing who left it, and there was only one person it could have been. He never asked for credit. He never referred to the help afterward. He simply appeared where he was needed, did what needed doing, and stepped back. She had spent 8 years telling herself that she appreciated him as a neighbor. She was beginning to suspect, standing in her kitchen with spring sunlight coming through the window and his large steady presence filling the room, that 8 years of telling herself that particular story might have constituted something of a lie. On Monday morning, Clark arrived before dawn with both his mule team and his own seed corn, which he had bought with his own money in Hays City the previous Saturday, and he did not mention the cost. Pauline found out anyway because she had her own contacts in town, and the news hit her with a force that took her breath away. He had spent $40, nearly 2 months of a hired hand's wages on seed for her fields. She confronted him about it at noon while they were eating the lunch she had brought out to the field, sitting on the tailgate of his wagon with the Kansas wind pulling at her hair and the smell of fresh-turned earth around them. "You can't afford to do that," she said. "My books are my business," he replied, not looking up from his food. "Clark." He looked at her then. "You want to fight about it or you want to plant corn?" She stared at him for a long moment. He did not flinch, did not look away, just met her gaze with that particular steadiness that had always unsettled her, because it was the kind of steadiness that asked you to stop pretending. "That was a reckless thing to do," she finally said. "Maybe," he said. "Eat your lunch." She ate her lunch. They worked together through April into May with a rhythm that developed naturally, without negotiation, the way things do between people who have orbited each other long enough to understand the other's patterns. Clark handled the heavy turning and the team, because the Turner farm's own pair of horses were older animals that tired quickly. Pauline handled the planting rows, the careful measurement, the irrigation channels, the endless small decisions of field management that required a person who knew this particular soil the way she knew it. She was good at the work. She had always been good at it. What surprised her was how different it felt to do it alongside someone. For 15 years, since she was 11 and her mother died, and she began taking on adult responsibilities in the fields, she had operated in a state of solitary competence that she had mistaken for self-sufficiency. Now, with Clark working 20 yards away, she began to understand that there was a difference between doing something alone, because you could, and doing it alone, because you had no other choice. She began to notice things about him that she had somehow managed not to notice before, or had noticed and filed away without processing. The way he talked to the mules, not roughly, but with a quiet authority that the animals clearly respected. The way he could read the sky with a farmer's instinct, stopping sometimes to look west with narrowed eyes, and then adjusting the day's plan before she even registered the cloud change. The small scar above his right eyebrow that she had always seen but never asked about. The fact that he sometimes hummed to himself when he was concentrating hard, a low tuneless sound that he seemed entirely unaware of. One evening in mid-May, she asked about the scar. They were sitting on her porch after supper. He had taken to staying for supper, which had started as her insisting on feeding him since he was putting in hours on her farm, and had gradually become simply what they did. And the evening light was doing that long, golden prairie thing that made everything look slightly more beautiful than it actually was. The scar, he repeated, reaching up to touch it with one finger, as though he had forgotten it was there. You don't have to tell me, she said quickly. It's not a secret, he said, though something in his voice suggested that the story around it might be. My brother threw a horseshoe. We were about 14 and 12. He was trying to impress some girl and missed the post by a considerable distance. He hit you in the face with a horseshoe. He was not known for his aim. Pauline laughed, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't produced in months, and something shifted in Clark's face when she did. Something softened around his eyes so briefly she almost missed it. What was his name? She asked. Your brother. A pause. Thomas, he said. Tom. Where is he now? The pause this time was longer, and she felt the temperature of the conversation change the way the air changes before a storm. He died, Clark said, in a voice that was very controlled and very quiet. During the war. He was 16. Pauline looked at him steadily. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. That doesn't always help as much as people think it should. He looked at her then with an expression she could not fully read, something grateful and something cautious, like a man who had been burned by sympathy before and was still deciding whether this version was safe. No, he said carefully. It doesn't. They sat with that for a while in the comfortable silence that had become one of the things she looked forward to most. Not all silences were comfortable. These ones were. They always had been, she realized, even from the beginning. In early June, a new complication arrived in the form of Gerald Mercer. Gerald Mercer was the local land agent for a Chicago property company that had been buying up failed farms across western Kansas for 3 years running, turning them into consolidated cattle range for eastern investors who never set foot on the land they owned. He was 45, well-dressed, with the particular smooth confidence of a man who believed his own sales pitch completely. He arrived at Pauline's farm on a Wednesday afternoon in a good suit and a rented buggy, and he sat down at her kitchen table without being asked, and laid out a proposition that was, from a purely financial standpoint, rational. The Chicago company would buy her out at a fair price, enough to clear the bank debt and leave her a few $100s besides. She could start fresh somewhere, he suggested, in town perhaps. Open a boarding house, something suitable. Pauline sat across from him and felt a cold rage build slowly in her chest. "This farm has been in my family for 22 years, she said. "Which is exactly why I'm offering you a dignified exit, Miss Turner," Mercer said, in a tone that managed to be both respectful and condescending at the same time, "rather than waiting for the bank to take it, which will leave you with nothing. I'll have the money by October." Mercer smiled the smile of a man who has heard this before. "On what income? You're one woman alone. The corn won't be in until September at the earliest, and corn prices this year." "I know the corn prices," she said. "I've been farming corn since I was 11 years old." "I have no doubt of your capability," he said. "I'm merely suggesting that. I think you should go now, Mr. Mercer," Pauline said, standing up. He went, but he left his card on the table, and he said, as he walked out, "The offer stands through August, Miss Turner. I hope you'll reconsider." She stood on the porch and watched his buggy go, and the cold rage in her chest became something slightly different, a trap-closing feeling, a dark awareness that he was going to circle back, that men like Gerald Mercer always did. She told Clark about it that evening. His reaction was quiet in the way that a controlled explosion is quiet, all the energy contained, but you could feel the pressure of it. "He had no business coming to you with that," he said. "He has every legal right to make an offer," Pauline said, because she was constitutionally unable to be unfair even to men who deserved it. "There's a difference between a legal right and common decency," Clark said. "Your father is 3 weeks in the ground when he first comes around." 6 weeks, she corrected. Still, he was quiet for a moment. "He'll be back. I know. He's probably watching the county records, watching for anyone who might default." Clark's voice had a particular edge to it, the edge of a man who recognized a certain kind of predation because he had seen it before. Companies like his bought up half of Missouri after the war. That's how it works. They wait for people to be desperate, and then they offer them less than the land is worth and call it a kindness. There it was. A piece of the dark past, offered without her asking because she had told him the truth about her situation and he was telling her the truth about his. It felt like something important. It felt like trust. "He won't get this farm," Pauline said. "No," Clark agreed. "He won't." The corn came up in June with a stubbornness that Pauline took as a personal vindication. She had chosen her seed varieties carefully. A short-season hybrid that her father had always favored, selected over generations for the particular conditions of their soil, which was good black loam in the lower fields and lighter, sandier ground on the ridge. Clark had supplemented with a variety of his own that he had been developing through careful selection for 3 years, a strain with particularly good drought resistance, and watching the two varieties come up together in the June warmth felt collaborative in a way that went deeper than just shared agricultural labor. In late June, they hit the first crisis. The creek that ran between their properties, which they had always shared informally for irrigation, was being diverted. Pauline discovered it on a Monday morning when her irrigation channel showed half its usual flow. She traced it upstream and found where the water had been redirected, channeled north with a new earthworks dam that had gone up over the weekend. The dam was on land that belonged to a man named Fletcher Oakes, who owned the property to the north of Clark's claim. Fletcher Oakes was not a farmer. He was a speculator, a man who had bought his land cheaply 3 years ago and held it while he waited for the right moment to sell. He had no crops, no stock, no legitimate use for the creek water he was now capturing. What he had was a recent conversation with Gerald Mercer, which Clark discovered by asking careful questions in town. "Mercer is trying to dry us out," Clark said when he brought this information to Pauline's porch that evening. "He's paying Oakes to redirect the water so your crops fail." The word hit her like a physical thing, trap. She was in a trap and she had not seen it being built. "Can he do that legally?" she asked, though she was afraid she knew the answer. "Kansas water law is muddled enough that it would take months to fight in court," Clark said. "Months we don't have." Pauline pressed her hands flat on the porch railing and looked out at her fields in the evening light, the rows of young corn catching the gold. $340 by October 1st. Half her water supply gone. Gerald Mercer circling like a patient hawk. "What do we do?" she asked. "We dig a second channel," he said. "There's another source, that spring on the south end of my property. I've never developed it because I didn't need it, but it's consistent. We dig a channel from there to your lower fields. It won't replace all the creek flow, but it'll be enough. That's a week of digging at least. Then we start tomorrow," he said, "and I'm going to talk to Oaks." "Clark, I'm just going to talk," he said, with an evenness that somehow made it more serious than if he had said it with heat. "I'm going to explain that what he and Mercer are doing is the kind of thing that has consequences in a community of people who remember who helped who and who did not." Pauline looked at him for a long moment. "You're not going to threaten him?" "I'm going to be very honest with him about the nature of reputation in a small county," Clark said carefully. "That's all." She could not quite tell if she believed him, but she also could not quite bring herself to argue further, because there was something deeply warming about having someone in her corner who was willing to stand there with that particular quiet, formidable intention. Clark rode to Fletcher Oaks Place the next morning. Pauline did not know exactly what was said. What she knew was that by Thursday morning, the earthworks dam had been partially dismantled, and the creek flow to her irrigation channel had been partially restored, not to full volume, but to something workable. Oaks, when she encountered him at the dry goods store the following week, avoided her eyes with the specific shame of a man who has been caught doing something he knows was wrong. Gerald Mercer made his second visit to her farm in early July. This time, Clark was there, repairing the fence along the south field while Pauline was working in the kitchen garden. Mercer pulled up in his buggy with the same smooth confidence as before, though something flickered in his expression when he registered Clark's presence 50 yards away. "Miss Turner," he said with that practiced, respectful, condescending tone, "I wanted to follow up on our conversation." "My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Mercer," she said. "The corn futures are down 8 cents since May," he said. "Your margin, I know what the margin is." Mercer glanced again toward Clark, who had stopped working and was watching the exchange without moving from his position at the fence. Not threateningly, not conspicuously, just watching in the specific way of a man who is making his presence known without making it an incident. "You have helped this season," Mercer observed. "Mr. Sutton, isn't it, your neighbor?" "That's correct." "And will Mr. Sutton be here in October when the bank comes to collect, Miss Turner?" Mercer asked, and there was something in his voice, something careful and calculated, that made her skin prickle. A hidden motive, she thought. He's not just making an offer. He wants to unsettle her. He wants her to feel the fragility of her situation, the way it depends on someone else's goodwill. "You'll have your answer in October," Pauline said. "Good day, Mr. Mercer." He left and she walked across the field to where Clark was still standing at the fence. He looked at her with a question in his eyes. "He was trying to make me doubt you," she said. "And did it work?" Clark asked, directly enough that it surprised her. "No," she said, and found that she meant it completely, which was its own kind of revelation. The work of July was relentless and honest, and it did something to both of them. There is a quality to shared hard labor that cuts through the usual social performances people engage in, the careful management of how one presents oneself, the distance kept for propriety. When you spend 10 hours a day in a field with someone, when you have seen each other muddy and exhausted and frustrated and triumphant, when you have eaten together and worked through problems together and sat on a porch in comfortable silence together, the social distance collapses. What is left is something more real. What was left between Pauline Turner and Clark Sutton, by mid-July, was something that both of them were clearly aware of and neither of them had yet found the words for. She noticed it in small things. The way he would sometimes stop and watch her from across the field, and when she looked up and caught him at it, he would not immediately look away. The way, when they ate supper together, the conversation had shifted from practical farm matters to everything. Her mother, his brother Tom, what she had wanted to be as a child before she understood that what she wanted to be was exactly what she was, what he had learned on the cattle drives that he still thought about. The way he had begun leaving small things. A good knife he had noticed she needed. A bolt of calico in a color she had once mentioned admiring, laid on her porch without comment. She noticed it in herself too. The way she had begun to be aware, in her body and not just her mind, of the way he moved through her space. The way she listened for his boots on the porch. The way her chest did something complicated when he laughed, which was rare enough that it felt significant each time. She was afraid of it. Not of him. She had never been afraid of Clark Sutton, but of what it meant to want something she had not been expecting to want, in the middle of the most precarious season of her life. It felt dangerous to let her heart engage in negotiations when her financial situation was not yet resolved. It felt like the kind of thing that could break her if it went wrong. She told herself, firmly, to focus on the corn. She managed this position for approximately 2 weeks, until the evening of July 22nd when Clark's horse came back to her farm without Clark on it. The animal was lathered and agitated, one stirrup torn loose, which meant a fall and a bad one. Pauline did not think. She went straight for the horse, got on bareback, which she had not done since she was a girl, but the body remembered, and let the animal take her where its instincts led, which was south across the boundary line and into Clark's property, into the lower creek drainage where the land got rough with limestone outcroppings and sudden soft spots. She found him on the ground beside the creek, conscious but unable to stand, his left leg twisted wrong beneath him. The horse had stepped into a sinkhole at the creek bank and gone down hard, and Clark had come off badly. "Your leg," she said, dropping beside him. "I know," he said, through what she recognized as controlled pain, the voice of a man who has been hurt before and knows the discipline of not surrendering to it. "I'm going to straighten it," she said. "I know," he said again. She had set bones before, her father's finger, a ranch hand's wrist in the harvest of 1874, but never anything like this. And the sound Clark made when she worked the leg back into alignment was the worst sound she had heard since the night her father died. Her hands were steady throughout, because that was who she was, but when it was done, when she had the leg bound with her petticoat torn into strips and Clark was breathing hard but even beside her, she found that her hands were shaking after the fact. He noticed. He reached up and put one large, rough hand over both of hers, and the steadiness of his grip was so precisely what she needed that she had to look away from him to compose herself. "You came fast," he said. "Your horse came back without you," she said, still looking at the creek. "Good horse." "Yes." His hand was still over hers. "Pauline." She made herself look at him. He was pale from pain, and the side of his face was scraped raw from the fall. And he was looking at her with that expression she had been trying not to name since April, the one that was not pity, and was not simple neighborly concern, and was not anything she could convincingly categorize as professional regard. "I need to get you to the house," she said. "In a minute," he said. "Clark, your leg in a minute," he said again, and his voice was quiet and certain in that particular way of his. "I need to tell you something before we go back to being practical about the leg." She waited. "I'm not here just for the farm," he said. "I want you to know that. What I'm doing this season, it's not only because of the farm." The prairie wind moved across the creek bed, and the cottonwoods above them made their papery sound, and Pauline felt something shift in her chest like a door opening that she had been pretending was just a wall. "I know," she said softly. "You know," he repeated, and there was something quietly amused and quietly profound in his voice at the same time. "I've known for a while," she admitted, which was more than she had intended to say, which was also more honest and therefore better. "And?" he asked. She looked at him fully. This man who had spent 3 months showing up for her without hesitation, who had bought her seed with his own money, who had faced down Gerald Mercer's games and Fletcher Oak's treachery, who had hummed tuneless songs to himself while plowing her fields, who had told her about Tom without being asked, who had held her shaking hands by a Kansas creek without making it smaller than it was. "And I think we should get you to the house," she said. "And then I think we should talk." Getting Clark to the house required her to go back for the wagon, and then the considerable challenge of getting him onto it with a badly broken leg, and then the drive back over rough ground. And through all of it, he was stoic in a way that drove her slightly crazy because she could see the effort it cost him, and she wished she could carry some of it. Dr. Hale came out from Hay City the next morning, a 14-mile round trip that Pauline made on horseback before dawn, which meant that Clark spent the night in her father's bed because she could not in good conscience send him across the boundary line in that condition. She sat up with him through the night, not in a romantic way, simply in the way of a person who understands that someone who is in significant pain should not be left alone with it. They talked through the night. That was what happened. Not about the farm, not about the bank, not about Mercer or the corn or the water rights. They talked about everything else, everything they had not made time for in 8 years of proximate acquaintance. She told him about her mother, about the particular kind of absence that losing a parent young creates in you, the shape of the space they leave that never quite gets filled. He told her about Missouri, about what had happened during the war, a story that involved his family's farm being taken by occupying soldiers, his father's death from a fever brought on by the shock and exposure of the displacement, Tom's death in a skirmish he had no business being in at 16, and Clark himself at 17, completely alone, everything he had known gone. The dark past, named at last not as a confession but as a gift, the gift of being known. She understood, hearing it, why he had come west and bought land and refused to leave it. She understood, too, something important about why he was here in her corner this season, fighting for her farm as if it were his own. He knew exactly what it meant to lose your land. He knew the particular destruction of it, and he had decided that it would not happen to her. When Dr. Hale arrived in the morning and examined the leg, his assessment was that Clark had broken the fibula cleanly and would need 6 weeks off it completely, and then a further month of careful work before he was fully functional. This was, from a practical standpoint, a disaster. They were in mid-July. The corn needed attention every week through August, the cultivation, the management of the irrigation channels, the watching for pest damage and weather events. Clark was the stronger half of their operation. "I can manage," Pauline told him, when Hale had gone and Clark was propped in her father's bed looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who was doing complicated math in his head. "The South Field needs. I know what the South Field needs," she said. "I've been farming this land my whole life, Clark. I didn't forget how to do it just because I had help this summer. That's not what I said. It's what you were about to work yourself around to." He looked at her sideways, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it sometimes did, the almost smile that was somehow more affecting than a full one. "You're impossible," he said. "I'm efficient," she corrected. "Rest. I'll be in to check on you at noon." She managed. It was not easy. It was, in fact, some of the hardest work she had done in years, operating the full capacity of both her farm and the parts of Clark's that needed covering, because she was not going to let his crops fail while he was down any more than he had let hers fail. She hired a young man named Eddie Marsh from Town 17, eager, willing, for the heaviest labor, paid him out of her monthly butter and egg income which she had been saving carefully. Between the three of them, 2 able bodies and 1 man directing from a chair he had dragged to the field's edge once he could bear to be moved, they kept both operations running. Clark being effectively stationary for 6 weeks created a different kind of proximity, a slower, more domestic one. He was at her house every day because it was not practical to move him back across the boundary. The road between the 2 farms was rough enough that the movement would have been dangerous. He graduated from her father's bed to the porch chair, and then to a position of general occupation of her porch and kitchen that felt, by mid-August, entirely natural. They cooked together. He was unexpectedly capable in a kitchen, had learned necessity during his years of solitary living, and she found watching him manage a meal on one leg, with the careful, methodical concentration he brought to everything deeply endearing in a way she was no longer trying to hide from herself. They read aloud to each other in the evenings from the few books she owned, A volume of Dickens, a battered almanac, her father's Bible, which she read from more for the comfort of the familiar words than for any particular piety. They argued about corn prices and water rights, and the proper way to store seed, and the relative merits of different mule breeds, and then sat in companionable silence with the stars coming out over the Kansas prairie. And sometimes she would look at him, and he would look at her, and neither of them would say anything, because something had reached a stage where saying something felt less necessary than simply being in it. One evening in late August, with the corn in the upper field tasseling and the lower field showing fat ears that made Pauline's heart rise every time she walked the rows, she brought supper out to the porch and found him watching the fields with an expression she recognized, because she had worn it herself, the look of a person who loves a piece of land so completely that the sight of it doing well is a physical relief. "It's going to be enough," she said, sitting down beside him. "I did the calculations today. If the price holds, and the yield is what I'm projecting, it'll be between $350 and $400 clear after costs." He turned to look at her, and his face was doing that thing again, that soft, unguarded thing that she had learned over these months was the truest expression he owned, the one that appeared when he had stopped managing what he showed. "I knew it would be," he said. "You didn't know," she said, smiling. "You hoped." "Both," he conceded. She looked at him, this man on her porch in the August evening with his leg in its splint and his dark hair catching the last light, and she felt everything she had been careful about and precise about and practical about all summer give way to something simpler and more honest. "Clark," she said. "Yes," he said quietly, and the way he said it, not as a question but as an answer, as if whatever she was about to say was something he was already answering yes to, undid her completely. She leaned forward and kissed him. He kissed her back with a gentleness that surprised her, and then a depth that did not, and his hand came up to her face with a care that felt like everything she had needed someone to mean for a very long time. When they drew back, both of them were still for a moment, the way you are after something true and significant. "I've been wanting to do that," she said, "since about June." "April," he said. She laughed. "You have not." "The day I came over with the coffee tin," he said. "When you opened the door and I could see you'd been crying and you refused to let it show. You were so," he paused, searching. "You were so much yourself, even with everything bearing down on you." She did not know what to do with that, with the precision and the feeling of it. She looked at him for a long moment and felt the full weight of what had been building between them. Not a sudden thing, she realized. Not something this season had created, but something this season had finally forced into the open, 8 years of quiet accumulation arriving all at once. "I don't want you to go back to just being my neighbor," she said. "I have no intention of it," he said, simply and completely. September came in hot and then cooled into something golden and perfect, and the corn harvest was everything Pauline had projected and slightly more. Eddie Marsh and 2 additional hands Clark recommended from town brought in the crop over 2 weeks of steady work, and Pauline stood in her barn at the end of it with the bins full, and the numbers in her ledger adding up to something that made her press both fists to her mouth to contain the emotion. $382 net. After seed, after hired help, after every cost she had incurred through the season. The bank would have its $340, and she would have $42 left, and the farm would be hers. Clark was on his feet again by the second week of September, the leg healed clean and straight. He stood beside her in the barn and looked at the numbers in her ledger and said nothing for a moment, and then he put his arm around her simply, naturally, as if he had been doing it for years, and she leaned into him and let herself feel the full magnitude of what they had done. "We did it," she said. "You did it," he said. "Clark." "We did it," he agreed, and she could hear the smile in his voice. On the 1st of October, Pauline Turner walked into the First National Bank of Hays City with $340 in cash in a leather pouch, and paid off every cent of her father's debt. The bank officer, a dry little man named Perkins who had always looked at her with a skeptical squint, stamped the paid receipt with what she chose to interpret as reluctance, and handed it across the counter. She stood on the boardwalk outside with the receipt in her hand and the October sun on her face, and felt a joy so clean and complete that it was almost like grief, because her father was not there to see it. Clark was there. He had ridden into town with her, tied his horse beside hers at the hitching post, waited on the boardwalk while she went inside, and he was standing in the October light when she came out, watching her face with that steady, patient attention that was so essentially him. She handed him the receipt and watched him read it. He looked up at her. "Done," he said. "Done," she confirmed. He folded the receipt carefully, handed it back, and then he did something she had not quite expected. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small, careful object, a ring, simple gold, the kind of thing a man buys when he has thought about it more than he has acted on it. He held it in his palm between them, not presenting it yet, just letting her see it. "I bought this in August," he said, "when I was still on the porch and thinking more than I was doing." Pauline looked at the ring and then at him. "August," she repeated softly. "I was working up to the asking," he said. "I wanted the farm to be secure first. I didn't want you to feel," he paused carefully, "as though the two things were tangled, the help and the question." She understood. He had kept them deliberately separate. He had not wanted her to wonder ever whether she had accepted him because she was desperate or grateful, or whether he had offered himself as part of some hidden transaction. He had waited until the farm was resolved so that what he was asking could only be about what it actually was. That was so exactly Clark Sutton that she felt a wave of tenderness that went all the way down to her foundation. "Ask the question," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Pauline Turner, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without a pause, without a qualification, without anything but the simple truth. He put the ring on her finger right there on the boardwalk of Hayes City, and 3 separate passers-by witnessed it, and one elderly woman near the dry goods store clapped her hands together and called out something warm and congratulatory. And Pauline laughed and Clark smiled, a full, real smile, the rare kind, and she thought she would remember it as long as she lived. Gerald Mercer made one last visit. He appeared at her farm in mid-October, 2 weeks after the bank payment, and he had somehow already heard about the engagement because Hayes City was the kind of town where news traveled faster than horses. His manner was different this time. The smooth confidence was still there but muted, as if he had recalibrated his understanding of the situation. He stood at the gate, not coming all the way to the door, which she interpreted as a small concession. "I wanted to offer my congratulations," he said, "on the season, and on your upcoming marriage." "Thank you," she said from the porch, not going to the gate. "I also wanted to say," he paused, and for a moment she saw something that might have been genuine discomfort in his face, "that I perhaps came at you too hard this season, under the circumstances." She studied him for a moment. She was not sure she believed in the sincerity of it entirely, but she also believed that people could see their own behavior more clearly in hindsight, especially when the behavior had not achieved its intended purpose. "I appreciate that, Mr. Mercer," she said. "The farm is not for sale. It never will be." He nodded once, put his hat back on. "Good luck to you, Miss Turner, or I suppose soon enough, Mrs. Sutton." He left, and she did not think he would come back, and he didn't. Fletcher Oaks moved off his property the following spring, sold it to a farming family from Ohio who put in winter wheat and were, by all accounts, good neighbors. The water rights question resolved itself with the arrival of proper property owners who had no reason to play Mercer's games. The wedding was in November, when the work was done, and the season had turned, and the Kansas sky had gone that particular deep winter blue that Pauline had always thought was the most beautiful sky in the world, even when she had been struggling in it. They were married by the circuit preacher who came through Hayes City on the 2nd Thursday of every month, in a ceremony that was simple because both of them preferred simplicity, and attended by perhaps 30 people, because they had more friends and goodwill in the county than either of them had perhaps realized until the day people showed up for them without being asked. Eddie Marsh was there, grinning broadly. The bank officer Perkins was there, with his wife, looking only slightly less skeptical than usual. Various farming families who had known Elias Turner and respected his memory came out in the November cold to see his daughter well settled. Pauline wore her mother's dress, let out at the hem, with a new collar of ivory lace she had bought in Hayes City with the $42 that had been left over after the bank payment. She had spent a significant portion of that $42 on the lace and considered it money well spent. Clark wore his best dark coat and a new shirt, and he looked at her when she came up the aisle of the little Hayes City church with an expression that made the circuit preacher momentarily lose his place in the words. After the ceremony, standing in the church with his hand warm over hers, and the ring she had slipped on his finger during the exchange of vows, still something she kept looking at with a private joy, Clark bent close and said quietly, "Your father would have liked this." Pauline thought about Elias Turner, his pipe tobacco, and his stubbornness, and his 22 years of loving a particular piece of Kansas earth into productivity, and the debt he had left her that had nearly been the end of everything, and the way that same near end had brought her to this moment, this man, this life. "He would have liked you," she said. "He always did." Clark looked at her with something that moved behind his eyes, something grateful and private, and he squeezed her hand and they went out into the November cold together, into the brilliant blue sky and the dry crisp air, and it felt like beginning. They settled into a life that had all the texture and complication of real things. There were decisions about the two farms. They were adjacent, which created both opportunity and logistical challenge. They discussed it through the winter, sitting at the kitchen table she had pressed her hands flat on in April and staring at maps and ledgers, and the conclusion they reached was elegant. Clark's farm and hers would operate as a single entity under combined management, rotating crops across the full acreage, pooling equipment and labor, with the combined scale giving them a better position in the market than either farm had alone. Clark moved into the Turner farmhouse because it was larger, and because she told him plainly that she was not leaving the house her father had built, and he had not argued because he understood that kind of attachment better than anyone. He built shelves in the bedroom for her books and a new kitchen table because he thought the old one was tired, though she argued that the old one had character, and he said character was not the same as structural integrity, and they managed to have that argument with enough warmth that it mostly functioned as entertainment. His brother Tom's memory came and lived in the house with them in the way that important dead do, present in occasional mentions. In a drawing Clark had that was the only image he possessed of Tom, which he put on the small shelf beside their bed. In the way Clark sometimes went quiet on certain dates without explanation, and she would simply be present with him in it, not pushing, knowing that some grief needed only company and not resolution. Her mother and father lived there too, in the smell of the kitchen, and the set of the kitchen garden, and the particular way the porch caught the evening light that her father had aligned by design when he built it. The spring of 1879 was a different kind of season. They planted together, the two farms' worth of acreage, with a confidence that felt different from the desperate hope of the previous year. Clark had hired 2 permanent hands for the season's steady men, brothers from a German family who had settled nearby, Hans and Wilhelm Bauer, who were excellent workers and brought with them a kind of solid goodwill that expanded the sense of their operation. In April, 1 year exactly from the morning Clark had come to her door with a coffee tin and his hat, and read the bank letter twice, and said, "We get it planted starting Monday," Pauline discovered that she was going to have a child. She told him in the evening on the porch, because the porch had become their traditional venue for significant conversation. She said it simply, watching his face, and watched what moved across it, a sequence of things, surprise and then something that gathered and deepened into a joy so complete and slightly overwhelmed that she felt her own eyes fill in response to it. He stood up from his chair, which he rarely did dramatically, and came to her and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a moment with everything visible in his expression, no management of it at all. "Are you well?" He asked first because that was Clark Sutton, the love in him always expressed first as care. "I'm well," she said. "I'm very well." He kissed her then, deeply and slowly, and held her afterward on the porch in the April evening with the spring coming up all around the farm, the early green in the fields and the cottonwoods budding along the creek and the sky that particular pale gold of Kansas in late April, and she felt the full weight of how much life had changed in a year, the terror of that April morning and now this April evening, the farm safe and expanded, and this man's arms around her and a child coming. "A whole year," she said. "From the coffee tin," he said, which made her laugh against his chest. "From the coffee tin," she agreed. Their son was born in December of 1879. He was large and healthy, and he announced his arrival into the world with a vigor that suggested he had opinions about it, and Clark, who Pauline had somewhat expected to be stoic and controlled in the delivery room. The way he was controlled in every high-pressure situation was in fact neither of those things. He held Pauline's hand through the whole of it, and when the midwife placed the baby in his arms, the look on his face was one she knew she would keep for the rest of her life. They named him Elias Thomas Sutton. Elias for her father, Thomas for his brother. Both of them understood what they were doing, giving those names to this new life. They were saying that the people who had been lost were not erased, that they were carried forward into the next generation, that love does not end with death but becomes part of what is passed on. Young Elias, as they called him from the start to distinguish him from his grandfather's memory, was a round, serious-faced baby who regarded the world with the same careful attention his father brought to everything, and Pauline found this deeply funny and deeply right. The farm prospered through 1880 and into 1881. The combined acreage under Clark's management and Pauline's specific knowledge of the soil produced steadily, and they weathered a dry summer in 1880 with the spring irrigation system Clark had developed, the one he had dug to save her crop during the water crisis, and which now served the whole operation. They expanded into a small cattle herd, 12 head, nothing ambitious, but a useful diversification, and Clark built a proper barn to house them in the spring of 1881. Hans and Wilhelm Bauer became fixtures, almost family, the kind of help that makes a farm not just an operation but a community. Their mother, a forthright woman named Greta who had all her sons' practicality and more warmth than all of them combined, became something like a friend to Pauline in the way women become friends on the frontier, through shared labor, through trading knowledge, through the recognition of each other's intelligence and competence in a world that frequently underestimated both. In the summer of 1881, Pauline and Clark rode together into Hays City for the county agricultural fair, which they had never attended as a pair before, and won the prize for best winter wheat, which was gratifying, and also the community respect that came with being known as people who had fought for their land and kept it, which was more gratifying still. They were the Suttons of the South Quarter sections, people said. Solid people, good neighbors, the kind who showed up. Clark Sutton, it turned out, was exactly the same kind of neighbor to others that he had been to Pauline, the kind who appeared when needed without waiting to be asked. When the Bauer family's eldest son, not Hans or Wilhelm but an older brother who had only recently arrived from Germany, broke his arm badly in a horse accident in August of 1881. Clark was there with labor and money for the doctor, and a very practical assessment of how the Bauer fields could be managed while the arm healed. It was so precisely what he had done for Pauline that she watched it from a slight distance and felt the love she had for him crystallize into something even clearer than before. Not a surprising feeling, but a deepened one. The way you understand a piece of music better the 5th time you hear it than the first. Young Elias was 2 years old by the fall of 1881, walking with the unsteady determination of a toddler and already demonstrating an interest in the barn animals that was going to make him a farmer of some kind, clearly, inevitably, which both his parents regarded as the most natural and right thing possible. Pauline discovered she was expecting again in October. This time she was less anxious about the telling, less watchful of Clark's reaction, because she knew what it would be. She was right. He took her hands across the kitchen table after supper, where she had told him with the same calm directness she brought to everything, and he smiled that rare full smile and said, "Elias is going to be very important about this." "He's going to be very bossy about it," she agreed, and they laughed together in the kitchen they had been sharing for 3 years now, the kitchen that smelled of their combined life coffee and wood smoke and bread, and the particular smell of good Kansas land that people who work it carry in their skin. And it was so abundantly right that it felt sometimes like something she had imagined, except that imagined things do not have the specific weight and texture of real ones. Their second child was born in May of 1882, a girl this time, small and fierce, with Pauline's gray eyes and Clark's dark hair, and a disposition that made clear from her first week of life that she was going to be her own complete person without reference to anyone's expectations. They named her Ruth, after Pauline's mother. When Pauline held Ruth for the first time and looked up to find Clark watching her, watching both of them, she realized, his wife and his daughter, with an expression of such undefended tenderness that it made the room feel larger. She thought about April of 1878, about the letter on the kitchen table and the fear and the desperate arithmetic of a single season's hope. She thought about what that season had been, not just the season of saving the farm, though it had been that. It had been the season of learning that showing up for someone, day after day, without making it conditional on reward or recognition or perfect outcomes, was a form of love even before it called itself that. It had been the season of learning that accepting help was not a concession to weakness but an act of trust, and that trust, offered and honored, was how love actually built itself in the real world rather than the imagined one. She thought about all the ways it could have gone differently. If Clark Sutton had been a different kind of man, the kind who calculated the advantage in situations before committing to them, if she had been too proud to let him in, if the corn had failed, or the water had not been recovered, or Mercer had been more aggressive, or the leg had healed wrong. There were so many ways it could have gone, and it had gone like this, like two people learning each other by showing up, day after day, until showing up became the thing they could not imagine not doing, and then became love, and then became everything. Clark moved to sit beside her on the bed, his shoulder against hers, and looked down at Ruth. His daughter looked back at him with the focused seriousness of a newborn encountering the world for the first time, apparently undecided about whether she approved of it. "Hello, Ruth," he said quietly. The baby's face worked through a series of expressions that suggested she was reserving judgment. "She's going to be like you," Clark said. "I hope so," Pauline said. "I hope she's going to be like both of us." He turned to look at her, and she could see in his face everything that they had become to each other. The history of it, the work and the difficulty and the joy of it, the depth of it. 8 years of neighboring and 1 season of everything and 3 years of building a life, and they had barely started. "She's going to grow up on land that almost wasn't saved," Pauline said, "and she's going to know it. I want her to know it." "She'll know it," Clark said. "She'll know what it cost." "And what it gave," Pauline said. He put his arm around her. Ruth settled between them, and outside the window of the farmhouse that Elias Turner had built in 1856, and that Pauline Turner had saved in 1878, and that Clark Sutton had helped her save and then made his home. The Kansas spring was doing everything it always did, coming in gold and green and relentless, full of the particular stubborn beauty of a place that does not make things easy but makes them real. Young Elias, 2.5 years old, appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt and regarded his new sister with the expression of someone reassessing their position in the world. "Baby," he said, pointing. "Yes," Pauline confirmed. "Your sister." "Her name is Ruth." Elias considered this. "No," he said. "Yes," Clark said, with the absolute calm of a man who has learned when to be immovable. Elias looked at his father, then at his mother, then at the baby, performing the calculation of a child learning the limits of negotiation. Then he walked across the room and stood on his toes to see Ruth better, and something in his face shifted into something younger and more open than his customary seriousness, something that might have been the beginning of love. "Ruth," he said, trying the name. "Ruth," Pauline agreed. He nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to his room. They listened to the small sounds of the farm settling into evening, the cattle in the barn, the horses, the wind in the new leaves on the cottonwoods. And Clark held her and Pauline held Ruth, and the farmhouse that had known both terror and triumph held all of them. And the Kansas sky outside went dark and filled with stars the way it had been doing for 10,000 years, and would go on doing long after all of them were memory. There were hard years after 1883 brought a late frost that took most of the winter wheat, and they had to recalculate everything. But they had the cattle and the reserve they had built, and they weathered it without debt. 1885 was a drought year that tested every farm in the county, but the spring and the irrigation systems Clark had developed held, and they lost less than most. There were years of disagreement between them about money, about decisions, about the proper management of stubborn children, about whether the old kitchen table had character or needed structural intervention, an argument that continued for years with undiminished energy on both sides. There was a year when Clark's old grief returned in force, in 1884, the 20th anniversary of Tom's death, and Pauline sat with him through it the way he had sat with her when grief was hers, simply present, not trying to fix it, understanding that some things needed only to be accompanied. He told her more about Tom that year than he ever had stories from childhood, the horseshoe incident detailed in full, hilarious specific, the way Tom had laughed, the particular quality of his company that had never been replaced. Pauline told him things about her mother that year too, things she had held quietly for a long time, and it felt like they were giving each other their dead to keep, adding them to the shared house of their marriage, the combined history that was bigger than either of them alone. Young Elias started school in Hays City in 1885, making the ride with a neighbor's older children 3 days a week, returning with the particular self-importance of a child who has acquired knowledge and wishes to deploy it extensively at supper. Ruth, 3 years old, regarded her brother's learning with competitive intensity and demanded that Pauline teach her letters at home, which Pauline did with a delight she did not try to conceal. Clark taught Elias to handle a team of horses on the home fields when the boy was 6, with the same quiet authority he had always shown with animals, and Pauline watched from the fence and felt the progression of it. Her father had taught her, and now Clark was teaching their son, and the land was the through line of it, the constant, the thing that outlasted everything and asked only that you keep showing up for it. In the spring of 1887, they planted the south field with a new strain of winter wheat that Clark had spent 4 years selecting, patient and systematic, improving on the drought-resistant variety he had been working with when they first collaborated. It was their best crop that year and the year after, and by 1888 other farmers in the county were coming to ask Clark about the seed, and he gave it freely, the way he gave most things, without accounting, without keeping score. Pauline Turner Sutton, by 1888, was 36 years old, which was not old, though the frontier aged people in some respects faster than the calendar strictly required. She was also, people in Hays City would have told you without hesitation, one of the steadiest and most respected presences in the county, a farmer in her own right, a woman who knew her land and her market and her mind, and whose opinion on agricultural matters was sought by people who would not, 10 years earlier, have thought to seek a woman's opinion on such things. This had not happened through her making any particular argument for it. It had happened through the patient authority of results, the kind of authority that cannot be argued with. Clark, at 40, was the same as he had always been, only more so quieter, more certain, more rooted. The lines around his eyes were deeper and his hair had the first silver in it at the temples, and he wore both as naturally as he wore everything, without comment, without apparent concern. He was still the man who showed up. He was still the first person in the county when someone needed help, still the man who went without being asked, still the man who made his help available without making the recipient feel obligated. He was also, Pauline knew, deeply happy. She knew it not because he was demonstrative in the way some men are, announcing their happiness, performing it. She knew it because she had spent a decade learning to read him, and what she read was a man who had come west alone with nothing and had built something real, something that would last, something that was composed of land and work and love in roughly equal measure, and who knew this, and for whom knowing this was enough. She was deeply happy too. In December of 1888, 10 years from the winter that had taken her father and left her with the bank letter and the desperate arithmetic of a single season, Pauline and Clark sat on their porch in the early dark of a winter evening, Elias and Ruth in the house behind them finishing supper and conducting some negotiation about whose turn it was to wash the dishes that sounded increasingly like a debate society event. Clark had brought coffee out to the porch, which was a habit that had never stopped being meaningful to her, coffee and his presence, the specific combination of those two things that had been the beginning of everything. 10 years, she said. He knew what she meant without her specifying. He always did. 10 years, he confirmed. The farm paid off what it owed, she said, plus interest. He smiled at that, the accounting metaphor, which was pure Pauline. Considerably more than it owed, he said. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her in the easy, natural way of people who have been doing this for a decade, and for whom the gesture has accrued 10 years of meaning so that it is never simple, always carries everything. I think about that April morning, she said, when you came in with the coffee and picked up the letter. I was terrified, he said. She sat up to look at him. Of what? Of what would happen to you if the numbers were as bad as I suspected they were, he said simply. I didn't have the resources to simply solve it. I could do a lot, but I couldn't make $340 appear. All I could offer was work and time, and he paused, and the look he gave her was the truest kind, completely unmanaged, all of myself, which felt inadequate to the size of the problem. Pauline looked at him in the winter dark, this man who had given all of himself freely and without condition, and in doing so had been more than adequate to every problem the season had presented. It was everything, she said. It was exactly everything. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he kissed her slowly in the cold December air, with the stars coming out over Kansas, and the children's voices carrying warm and argumentative from inside the house that was full of their shared life. Inside, Ruth had apparently won the dishwashing argument, because Elia's voice escalated into a complaint, and then subsided into the specific silence of a child doing something under protest. Clark and Pauline both registered this, and both smiled against each other's mouths, which made the kiss slightly undignified and thoroughly perfect. The Turner farm, the Sutton farm, as it had been legally for 10 years, though Pauline still thought of it as both, as the Turner-Sutton farm, carrying both histories, was 800 acres now, the two original quarter sections and an additional 200 acres they had bought from the Oaks property when it came to sale in 1882. They ran 140 head of cattle in the south pastures, planted winter wheat on the north fields, kept the kitchen garden, and the orchard Pauline had started in 1880 with apple and cherry trees that were just now beginning to produce in earnest. It was a good farm. It was a farm that had been fought for and kept and expanded through a decade of honest work, and it would belong someday to Elias and Ruth and whatever lives they made, and it would be there long after Clark and Pauline themselves had become part of the Kansas earth they had loved so well. The letter on the kitchen table in April of 1878 had said $340 by October 1st or everything ends. Everything had not ended. Everything had, in fact, begun. In the spring of 1889, with the winter wheat in the ground and the apple trees in the orchard just beginning to show their early white blossoms, Pauline stood at the boundary line between what had been her father's farm and what had been Clark's original quarter section, the line that had ceased to be a boundary in any real sense for a decade now, and thought about all the ways a single season can contain everything. The fear and the work and the discovery of love in the most unexpected form, not the romantic story she might have written for herself, but the truer one, the one that arrived in a coffee tin and a pair of working hands and a quiet refusal to let her face it alone. Clark came to stand beside her. He had a habit of finding her wherever she was on the property, not because he was looking for her, he was usually working, but because they had developed over 10 years a mutual gravitational pull that regularly resolved in proximity. He looked at the blossoming orchard she was looking at, the white flowers catching the April light. "Remember when these were just sticks in the ground," she said. "You had enormous faith in those sticks," he said. "I had enormous faith in a lot of things that looked like sticks," she said, and cut a glance at him that made the corner of his mouth do the thing. "Are you calling me a stick?" "I'm saying that things that are worth having sometimes look unpromising at first," she said primly. He laughed, a full laugh, one of the ones she had been collecting for 11 years. She stood in the April morning and let it land on her and felt the whole of it, the land and the season and the man and the life they had made from the most precarious of beginnings. "Clark," she said. "Yes," he said, exactly as he had always said it, as an answer rather than a question. "I am so glad you brought that coffee tin," she said. He put his arm around her and looked at their land, all of it, every acre, every fence post and furrow and apple tree and winter wheat row, with the expression of a man who is entirely and without reservation where he is supposed to be. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The Kansas spring went on around them, relentless and golden and full of the particular stubborn beauty of a place that gives nothing easily but gives everything truly. And the Turner Sutton farm grew and breathed and flourished in the morning light, exactly as it was always going to from the moment one neighbor showed up at a desperate woman's door with a coffee tin and decided, without being asked, that he was not going to let her face it alone.